Hi, welcome back again. So we've been looking at the history of game through the lenses of world events, as changes in political and social systems or as advancements in technology, and through the lens of social changes. Today we add economics to that list, in particular capitalism. The thing is, the history of capitalism is the history of games. Those things that have led to the evolution of games are also the same things that led to capitalism in the West. As people have had more time for luxury, capitalists sold them more recreational activities such as games. As machines made products faster and cheaper, mass-produced games became possible. As owners of intellectual properties looked for ways to capitalize on them, they turned to licensing games. As capitalists responded to demand, more innovative and varied games came about. And as capitalists invested in new technologies, games took advantage of that technology. And we've already looked at a number of examples of games in which the principles of capitalism were illustrated. We've seen games like Messenger Boy that promoted working as a way of gaining wealth in a capitalistic system, and Monopoly that used the flaws of capitalism to, originally, teach against private land ownership, but then was changed to actually promote the ideals of capitalism itself, as did other games of the time like Bulls and Bears. Poker itself, which relies on resources and risk-taking to gain wealth, can be viewed as a quintessential game of capitalism. We also saw how games were used to promote specific capitalistic enterprises, particularly department stores, which themselves are, of course, one of the great examples of capitalism in the 20th century. We also looked at games as being part of a marketing extension of other intellectual properties, a chance to capitalize on the character's popularity. And we saw the inclusion of game shows, themselves often integrated into a consumerism, capitalism culture. But there are many other examples. Many sim games, including The Sims itself, revolve around you performing tasks common within a capitalistic culture, such as running a business in order to progress. In fact, some of these games, like the tycoon-style games, have made capitalism their entire point. But nearly any game that has a focus on trade is likely to be capitalistic to some degree. If you buy, sell, or trade with other players, then you are likely doing so from a capitalistic perspective. And in many games you have to buy or invest in upgrades. Basically, anytime your character is an individual, which is fairly standard, and they have to advance by collecting a resource, then spend that resource on improving their game state, it's flirting with capitalism, if not fully engaging with it. But that's not all. What about games with shops? Almost every RPG has you buy and sell in a shop, and despite when and where that game is set, they all seem to run on a capitalistic principle. Or auction houses. In fact, Diablo 3 used to have a real money auction house, combining real-world capitalism into their fictional world. And combining real-world supply and demand within a game is not particularly new. The whole idea of collectible card games is to make some cards rarer than others, creating an artificial rarity, thereby increasing their demand and making them more valuable. And that brings us to this whole idea of microtransaction and loot boxes. Again, we have a scenario that even if the game's core isn't related to economy, a capitalistic means is central to the player experience. They're basically saying, you need a better weapon in this imaginary world, give me a resource from the real world. So you can see that today's gaming environment is drastically interwoven with capitalism. It reflects in our game's themes, mechanics, and obviously their distribution. However, it's not just been the examples of the games themselves that we've seen the effects of capitalism in. We've seen all kinds of examples of capitalism working or failing to work in some of the cases we've already looked at. We looked at Alex Patanov's Tetris, and what's interesting here is that it's one of the most successful games in terms of popularity, but it emerged from the Soviet Union, free of any real capitalistic incentives. So that challenges some of the ideas about how critical capitalism is for the creation of new game ideas. On the other hand, we have inventors like Bayer and Tomohiro Nishikado, who were directly paid to research and develop new and profitable ideas that turned out to be hugely important for the game's evolution. Yet again, Lawson, and if we even want to go back as far as Tesla, actually gave their discoveries to the public. And the release of these open standards to the public have proven to be immensely beneficial to society in numerous ways. But then you have companies like Milton Bradley, Parker Brothers, Atari, Infocom, and EA, who were obviously very interested in pursuing capitalistic goals when they formed. And you also have Space Wars and Colossal Cave, which were originally designed without commercial intent. So the point I'm hoping to make here is that though games undoubtedly have benefited from capitalism in tremendous ways, the argument of capitalism's influence on success in society is often overly simplified. And just looking at the game industry, you can see where games have grown because of capitalism, but we can also find cases where games became successful without, or sometimes because of the lack of, capitalistic influences. Today we're going to look at several different cases, and I'll let you draw your own conclusions as to how much capitalism affected them in positive or negative ways. But before we can get to that, now would be a good time to define capitalism. In its simplest form, capitalism is an economy in which the individual is the primary investor, owner, and consumer of goods and services. For example, if you buy paint, canvas, and a brush to make a piece of art, with the hope of recouping or even profiting from that piece, you are engaging in capitalism. You are investing in the supplies to make a product which you would own, with the plan of trading that to another consumer. Now, it's probably very important here to make a couple of distinctions. First, not every form of capitalism is the same. For that matter, neither would every form of socialism be the same. We are often presented with these ideas as dichotomies, something we have to choose between one or the other, and usually in terms of their extremes. The truth is, economic systems exist on a scale, and the ideal form of which is likely somewhere along that scale and not at its extreme edges. However, this is in an economic class, so we will not be spending time trying to solve what is the best economic system for society, but rather examine just how games have been affected by the different economies of the 20th and 21st century, by looking at some very specific cases as examples, and hopefully we'll find some evidence that you can use to inform a nuanced view of the role that economics and games have with each other. So real briefly, let's start by taking a look at some generally understood pros and cons of capitalism. Well, in theory at least, capitalism allows anyone to participate. Recreation is commercialized, so market forces can promote recreation activities and wealth can purchase these opportunities. It's in the best interest of the capitalists to hire the best workers, so again, in theory, a meritocracy should emerge. It encourages capitalists to invest in meeting demands, which requires research and development, which in turn creates innovation. It promotes the pursuit of large successes by rewarding more for better success, thereby increasing efficiency as investors will spend more resources only when it's likely to create better outcomes. Risk-taking is encouraged, with the ones that succeed being the ones rewarded. It gives customers the power by allowing their wants and needs to be prioritized. On the other hand, as a system, it only works in terms of has and has-nots. If everyone had all the resources they need, then no one would need to invest to gain more resources. This is problematic because those who have the most of a resource are rewarded with greater wealth, which then can be used to gain more resources, dividing the haves from the have-nots even further. Additionally, it promotes exploitation, first of the workers, as profits are made when costs are minimalized, and workers are evaluated as an expense to be reduced. Consumers are also at the risk of exploitation, as their true demands may be ignored in order to provide them with the illusion of having been met. Mislabeling goods or hiding flaws in a product are examples of this type of exploitation. And it's not only people that are at risk at exploitation in a capitalistic system. Resources themselves are at risk. Scarcity makes resources more valuable, so it's in the capitalist's best interest to reduce the amount of resources available, first by acquiring it themselves, but ultimately by destroying any excess to keep it away from their competitors. Also, if a resource happens to not do enough to currently promote wealth, perhaps because it's too difficult to utilize, or it conflicts with the existing wealth stream, or just simply lacks scarcity, the capitalist is encouraged to hoard it. It encourages the capitalists to engage in manipulation. Monopolies form in order to control prices that would harm the free market. Lobbying takes place that is in the best interest of certain investors against other investors, the consumer, or the workers. In its extreme form, it is completely without any moral judgment. If a service such as murder is in demand, then a capitalistic society would try to meet that demand. If slavery allowed for cheaper labor costs, then pure capitalism would accept it. It values the pursuit of both the advancement of medicine and the promotion of addiction equally. Furthermore, capitalists that refuse to engage in morally challenging behavior out of some ethics will always lose to those who can avail themselves of a more immoral strategy to better cut costs or increase profits. There are also no barriers to participate in a capitalistic endeavor save for the capital itself. You want to start a business building cars without knowing how one works? Go ahead. But while that might seem like a self-limiting problem, after all, if you sell bad cars, people probably aren't going to buy them. It also means that anyone in a capitalistic system can engage in an area that could affect public health or safety without restraint. They could just start making vaccines or teaching young children or mix chemicals regardless of what training, skills, or character they have and the danger that those activities might pose. It also promotes disruptions and obsolescence. It is often in a capitalist's benefit for existing products to become obsolete and replaced with their newer version. If the product you buy today were to last you a lifetime, there is no profit for the manufacturer to continue to produce it. So the only way to sell a car or a phone or a computer is to make one that's better than the one everyone currently has. And that means there's actually less value in the thing that you bought because of how temporary it is and therefore close to becoming obsolete. As the pace of new products increase, the quicker that devaluation occurs. So a skill or tool that used to last the consumer a lifetime had way more value then than a skill or tool that only lasts a handful of years does now. And finally, there's little incentive to consider long-term social consequences. The capitalistic system is designed for immediate gain so that wealth can be reinvested. Consequences, particularly long-term consequences, are not as relevant as wealth. That means capitalists in today's society tend to look as far as the next quarterly report as opposed to a more communal society like, say, the Iroquois, who had a philosophy of examining every decision they made as a tribe for its impact 7 generations down the road. Now, with all that said, there's one last thing we should look at before we go to the examples themselves. Games did have a huge impact on economics in the 50s, and that was with the development of what's called game theory. Now, it actually starts in 1928 when John von Neumann published a paper called On the Theory of Games of Strategy. Now, von Neumann was not a sociologist or ludologist, but a mathematician. And he wasn't interested in games, at least not games as we generally think of them, but in strategy, specifically turning economic decisions into mathematical formulas focused on competition. It introduced this idea of treating any system with conflicts as if it was a game where the parties wanted to win, and distilled everything down into a mathematical and logical model in order to study and evaluate the decisions made. This is the field of study that became game theory. In 1950, John Nass made an amazing breakthrough in solving many of the mathematical questions posed by game theory, with equations that illustrated what a winning strategy should be, as well as how certain players should be expected to behave when provided certain sets of limited information. A lot of this work focused on premises like, if company X lowered its price of product A by Y amount, then company Z should respond with whatever the equation spits out. The work was incredibly important in multiple areas of studies. Nass is widely accepted as having been a brilliant thinker, and he attributed a lot of his success to the fact that he suffered from schizophrenia and saw things differently than everyone else. And if anyone's interested, I heartily recommend the 2001 movie A Beautiful Mind, which explores both his brilliance and his mental health. So in game theory, they examine ideas like the prisoner's dilemma, how would a prisoner bargain to get the best plea deal, the tragedy of the commons, why does a good strategy become bad if everyone else does it, the volunteer's dilemma, why relying on a volunteer might be a bad strategy, and a stag hunt. which asks when is it best to cooperate in a hunt versus when is it best to hunt by oneself. All of these are reduced to a mathematical formula and then solved to show which decisions would provide the optimal results. For a long time, though, the game in game theory was considered to be something separate from game in like playing games. The game theory version of game was, so it was thought, just a simplification of real-world systems. But that distinction has changed somewhat. First, as games have become more complex, the designers and players look to these mathematical solutions to help them with similar in-game decisions, meaning that game theory is often now used to help decide how to best actually play a game. But also, if you think about it, a game is essentially a simplified model of a real-world system already, so game theory and game design are not really as separate as they were first thought to be. Which gets us to 1999, when an associate professor named Edward Castronova wrote a paper on economics within an MMORPG world. That created a huge stir in the academic community. His initial research in the game worlds opened the door for many economists and even social scientists to study the theories of human interaction in a virtually constructed and controlled environment. And those studies have provided new evidence for many theories in many different fields. Now it's not uncommon for scientists and game scholars to often engage in such discussions at conventions or to take positions within a game company to work on research that has implications far beyond the game they are observing.